Hi, my name is Evan. Today I am reading I Survived the Great Molasses Flood, 1919, by Lauren Tarshis. Chapter 1, Wednesday, January 15th, 1919, around 12:30 p.m., the North End, Boston. 12-year-old Carmen Grasso was drowning. She was caught in one of the deadliest disasters in the Boston history. A gigantic wave had crashed into a street, a swirling, raging monster moving faster than a train. It turned buildings to rubble. It smashed wagons and motor cars and tossed trucks into the harbor. 21 people would soon be dead. Many more were fighting for their lives. This killer wave wasn't made of water. It didn't come from the sea. The monstrous wave was made of a thick brown syrup, molasses. For years, millions of gallons of sticky molasses had been stored in a building-sized metal tank. The hideous tank loomed over Carmen's neighborhood, blotting out the sun. And in one ear-splitting moment, the molasses tank had exploded apart. Carmen and her best friend, Tony, had watched in horror as the tank began to shake, as its rounded steel sides bulged in and out. The tank seemed to have come alive, as if it were boiling with fury, ready to destroy. And then suddenly, thousands of the steel bolts that held the tank together let go. Bang, 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 bang! They blasted through the air like bullets fired from a machine gun. Seconds later, the metal tank blew apart completely. Jagged chunks of metal whirled through the air like knife-winged birds. The molasses hovered in the air like a black rolling cloud. Then, with a thundering crash, it hit the ground. Instantly, the streets became raging rivers filled with wreckage. Chunks of wood and metal and glass overturned motor cars and wagons. Horses whinnied in fear. Screams of terror rang out. "Run! Get out of the way! Help me!" Carmen ran for her life. Tony was right beside her, but the wave was moving too fast. Within seconds, the swirl of thick syrup had caught them. The molasses wrapped itself around Carmen's legs like millions of powerful snakes, dripping with slime. It rose up to her waist, her chest. She had to do something. And then she saw a broken wagon floating toward them. She and Tony both managed to climb on until a huge chunk of metal from the tank rammed into the wagon. Carmen tried to hold on as the wagon nearly flipped, but she slipped off and sank into the swirling flood of ooze. "Carmen!" Tony screamed. It was the last sound Carmen heard as the molasses rose over her head and swallowed her whole. Chapter 2. Almost 4 months earlier, Friday, September 27th, 1918, around 3:30 p.m., the North End, Boston. Carmen and her pal Tony were heading back from school, making their way through the noisy streets of their neighborhood, Boston's North End. Those wagons clattered and squeaked and motors honked. A young newsboy shouted out the front page headline, "Deadly flu hits Boston." Usually, Carmen and Tony would be talking and joking as they zigzagged their way through the packs of people that jammed the streets. They would maybe stop at Ortelli's bakery and see if they could sweet-talk Mrs. Ortelli into giving them a free creamy cannoli or crunchy biscotti. They always left empty-handed, but they kept trying because anything was possible, right? But today Tony was in a rotten mood. He walked lumpily, skinny shoulders slumped. Carmen had been trying to cheer him up, but nothing was helping. "He hates me," Tony moaned. He was the teacher, Mr. Lawrence. "No, he doesn't," Carmen said for the 100th time. Mr. Lawrence was the nicest teacher they'd ever had. Over the summer, he'd come back from fighting in the Great War. He'd been badly hurt in a bomb attack and couldn't go back into battle. So he came home and took a job as a teacher. He had a bad limb, but he acted like it didn't bother him. "I'm stupid," Tony continued. "No, you're not," Carmen said, rolling her eyes. How many times had she told him he was He just had to study harder, or maybe open a book for once. That was why Tony fluked the first big math test of the year. Carmen knew it wasn't the F that upset him. He'd had plenty of those for over the years. It was Mr. Lawrence's new idea to keep Tony in at recess so they could play some math games together. Carmen knew Mr. Lawrence was trying to help Tony. Tony thought Mr. Lawrence was trying to torture him. That test was impossible, Tony grumbled now as they wove through a big pile of horse miniature in the street. Well, Carmen said, she'd gotten 100, but she hadn't told Tony that. She'd carefully folded the test and slipped it into the pages of the book Mr. Lawrence had lended to her, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. The book was about a girl named Dorothy who gets sucked into a tornado and dropped down in a strange land called Oz. Carmen couldn't wait to show the test to Papa. He'd pin her perfect test up on the wall with all the others. Then he'd pat her cheek. This is why we came here to America, he'd say. They'd come here 4 years ago from a little village in Italy. The village was a beautiful place where Mama and Papa's families had lived for hundreds of years. But in 1908, when Carmen was 2 and a powerful earthquake struck the south of Italy, entire cities turned to dust in the earthquake. Minutes later, gigantic tidal waves rolled across the land. More than 100,000 people were killed, including Mama, who was swept away when the sea rose up. Carmen had only one memory of that terrible day, dim and hazy like a dream. She was clinging to Papa's back as the sea churned all around them. "Hold on," Papa had cried. "Hold on!" Papa's voice had risen above the roars of the waves, above the screams of all the people all around them. Carmen gripped the wonderful Wizard of Oz Carmen gripped the wonderful Wizard of Oz harder as Tony kicked a rotten apple core into the gutter. Papa never talked about the earthquake, but growing up in Italy, Carmen had heard the stories from her grandmother, Nana, and reminders of the disaster were everywhere in their village. The crumbling church, the ruined school, the graveyard where Mama was buried. Papa had wanted to stay in the village, but as the years crawled by, he realized there was no future there except for Carmen. The school never reopened, and most girls didn't go to school anyway. It was harder and harder for Papa to earn money as a farmer, and that's why, when Carmen turned 8, she and Papa got onto a big ship and came here to America. They begged Nana to come with them, but she refused. Someone needs to stay and watch over this place, Tesoro, she told Carmen. That's what she called Carmen, her treasure. Carmen hated leaving Nana, but she'd always been curious about the magical land across the Atlantic Ocean, America. Carmen had imagined golden streets, skyscrapers topped with rubies, wide open spaces where she and Papa would build their new life. Life would be much easier in America, she was sure. Carmen smiled to herself now, remembering how shocked she was when she and Papa first arrived here in the North End. She glanced around, flashing back to how all of this looked through her 8-year-old eyes. The sagging buildings, the piles of trash, the dark alleys filled with howling dogs. She and Papa lived in an apartment so small there was barely enough room for the two of them, and the families of rats that refused to leave. What was Papa thinking? She had written to Nana. He made a big mistake to come here. Why would anyone want to live in America? But Nana wrote her back, telling her to be patient. Trees don't grow overnight, she'd said. Why was Nana writing about trees? Carmen had wondered. There were hardly any trees in the North End anyway. Soon Carmen understood what Nana meant. It took time to get used to a new place. Like trees, she and Papa slowly grew into their new lives in the North End. She still missed Nana, of course, more and more even. and sometimes Carmen had to escape the crashing noises and crushing crowds. She'd find a quiet spot in her favorite park, close her eyes, and pretend she was back in the village. She'd picture the Italian flag flapping in the town square with its stripes and shield. Sometimes she could practically smell the sweet Italian breeze, a mix of lemons and flowers and the sea, but the North End was her home now. She loved school. There was always something new to see in the bustling city, and most of all, she loved their neighbors, Tony and his big, noisy family. They lived to the apartment right above them. They'd welcome Carmen and Papa from the start. Most nights, the delicious smells of Mrs. Grasso's cooking wafted under their door, and most nights Mrs. Grasso sent one of the kids down to invite her and Papa to join them for heaping plates of pasta or bowls of garlic soup with chai beans. Carmen glanced over at Tony now, smiling to herself. He was more like a brother than a best friend. She hated seeing him so sad, but then she had an idea that would definitely cheer Tony up. Come on, she said, grabbing his arm. I'll race you to the molasses tank. Chapter 3. Tony's face lit up as they took off running. Carmen knew he loved the taste of the thick, sticky syrup. And he wasn't the only one. Kids from the neighborhood visited the tank all the time. The tank leaked. Molasses was always dripping down the sides, like ice cream melting down a cone. Kids would scoop the molasses into their mouths with their fingers or turn sticks into molasses lollipops. Who needed to waste a penny at the candy store when you could get a taste of molasses for free? I thought you hated molasses, Tony said as they trotted along. Carmen shrugged. Maybe I'll take some to Rosie. Rosie was a horse, an old mare who lived at the stable where Papa worked. Carmen liked to take her out for rides after school. They'd go to the park by the harbor. Rosie would nibble on the grass, and Carmen would write letters to Nana. Her grandmother loved hearing about all the people in the North End, but Tony was her favorite. She called him Trotterine, wild boy. But today, Rosie and Nana's letters would have to wait. It took only a few minutes to get to the tank, which rose up over them like the mountains in Carmen's village back in Italy. Except the tree-covered mountains were beautiful. The tank was hideous, brown-painted steel covered with syrupy slime. Tony slammed his hand onto the sticky tank. I win, he said gleefully. Carmen grinned at her friend. She'd finally cheered him up. Nana's voice echoed in her mind. Ben Fatto. Good job. Wow, Tony said, pulling his hand away from the tank. His fingers dripped with syrup. It's leaking like crazy. Tony was right about that. The tank always leaked a little, but today the goo was bleeding through the lines where the sheets of metal came together. The thick streams of molasses ran down the sides. Tony stuck his finger into his mouth and closed his eyes. He said. Tastes like Cracker Jacks. Come and dip a finger into the syrup, then took a cat-like lick. Bleh! The molasses tasted sweet, but with a bitter back licorice aftertaste. She shook her head and made a face. Tony laughed. Then he smeared some molasses above his top lip, making a sticky brown mustache. Hello, he said, lowering his voice. I'm Mr. Lawrence. Recess is now against the wall. They both had a good laugh. Let's find some sticks, Tony said. He started walking around the tank, scanning the ground. Carmen didn't need a stick. She'd had enough molasses. Thanks. Plus, being this close to the tank gave her a queasy feeling. She tried not to look at the dead flies stuck in the goopy puddles on the ground. She wrinkled her nose as she breathed in the sickly sweet smell. Bleh was right. She stared at the tank, wondering why it leaked so much. Whoever built it did a bad job. And why did the molasses company have to put such a big tank right here? It blocked out the sun and ruined the views of the harbor. And Carmen hated to think about what all the molasses was used for. He heard Papa and his boss, Mr. Vita, talking about it at the stables a few years ago. They were in the little back office playing cards. Carmen was brushing Rosie. They say it can hold more than 2 million gallons of molasses, Mr. Vita said. 2 million gallons? That sounded like enough to fill a big pond. Papa whistled. What do you think they do with it all? Carmen had been wondering the same thing. She knew some famous American foods had molasses in them, like baked beans and gingerbread. But 2 million gallons? That was a lot of gingerbread. It's used for bombs, Mr. Vita said. Bombs? Papa said with surprise. Carmen nearly dropped Rosie's brush. Was Mr. Vita joking? No. He explained that the molasses went to a factory where it was boiled down into something called industrial alcohol. Then it was used to make dynamite and bombs. Strange, Carmen thought. But then Rosie started impatiently to get out for a walk. Carmen put the tank out of her mind. Back then, the molasses tank was just one of the many strange things about America. Carmen had only just figured out that red socks weren't things you wore on your feet. And why did so many English words have sneaker letters that made no sounds? The bombs didn't mean much to Carmen either back then. The Great War had just started, and Carmen in America hadn't joined in the fight against Germany. But now, 3 years later, tens of thousands of American soldiers had been killed in brutal battles. She knew this war was bloodier than any war before. There were new kinds of weapons, like machine guns that fired hundreds of bullets in a minute, and poisonous gas that burned soldiers' skin and lungs. Carmen stepped back and stared at the ugly tank, as if she were seeing it for the first time. She pictured Mr. Lawrence limping through the classroom. Suddenly, the molasses didn't seem like any fun at all. She looked at Tony, whose face was covered with goo. She couldn't help smiling a little. Hey, she said, you done yet? Just one more lick, Tony started, but he was cut off by a sound, a low gurgling growl. Grr, gug, 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 grr, gug, 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 gug. Chapter 4. The growling noise got louder. Grr, gug, 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 grr, gug, 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 gug. Is it dogs? Tony asked nervously. He looked around, eyes wide. Carmen's stomach tightened. The North End was infested with vicious stray dogs that roamed in packs. They howled in alleys that night, and many of them had rabies. If you got bitten, you die a grisly death. If you didn't get rabies shots stabbed into your stomach. The sound got even louder. Grr, ga 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 ga, grr, ga 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 ga. The ground around the tank shook. Carmen's heart pounded. Could it be an earthquake? She didn't think they had those in Boston. But what did she know? She whirled around ready to grab Tony and bolt. She imagined the North End crumbling apart like a village back in Italy. But the men working along the waterfront seemed to be doing what they always did. They were rolling their barrels and lugging their crates, talking and laughing. Look, Tony cried. Carmen followed Tony's gaze to the tank. The metal in front of them was vibrating as if it were breathing. Is there something in there? Carmen thought. Her heart skipped a beat. What if it's But just as quickly as the noise started, it stopped. The tank was still. Carmen and Tony were so focused on the tank that they didn't hear the footsteps creeping up behind them. Hey, what are you doing here? Boomed the voice. Carmen practically jumped out of her skin. She and Tony slowly turned around. A big belly man with a greasy black beard and small mean eyes stood over them. He was holding a huge club, and he looked like he was ready to crack some skulls. You're not allowed to be here, he growled. This is private property. Carmen realized he must be one of the company workers that owned the tank. Sorry, Carmen said, her voice shaking. We were just worried. We heard noises coming from the tank. The man shook his head and rolled his eyes like she and Tony were scared like babies. were scared little babies. "So what?" he said. "It's always doing that. Molasses makes noise. It boils up sometimes." He raised his club. "Now get out of here before I give you something to cry about." Carmen and Tony took off. The stable was only a couple 100 yards away. They stopped to catch their breath behind the shed. Their eyes met and they burst out laughing. "I thought there was a monster inside the tank," Tony cried. He made a face and turned his sticky hands into claws. He said, "I'm the molasses monster. Slime shoots out of my eyes." "Or maybe it was a shark," Tony said, turning his claws into a fin. It sneaked in onto the molasses ship and then wiggled through the pipe into the tank. Carmen smiled. Tony really was smart. It was true that the molasses came to Boston on big ships. The ships traveled from Cuba and Puerto Rico islands in the Caribbean. The molasses was pumped from the ships into the tank through a giant pipe. Carmen caught her breath and brushed some dirt off her coat. She didn't admit to Tony that what she really thought when she heard those noises. That a person was trapped inside? What if a worker had fallen in and was drowning, being smothered by the disgusting bitter goo? Just the idea made her heart pound with horror. But now she looked at Tony's grinning face and laughed. "Wait until Papa hears about this." Carmen and Tony burst through the squeaking stable door. Instantly, Carmen felt calmer as she breathed in the smell of hay and horses and heard the loud nicker of hello from Rosie. The mare was the only horse still at the stable at the time of the day. The others were out pulling wagons back and forth across Boston. Rosie was too old to work anymore, but Mr. Vita loved her too much to sell her. Rosie poked her white head over the door of her stall, flicking her ears and snorting softly. Carmen gave her a kiss on the nose. Tony rubbed her head. He loved her too. Rosie stuck out her long pink tongue and started licking Tony's face. Tony laughed. "I think you like molasses even more than I do," he said to Rosie. "Papa," Carmen called. "We're here." Carmen expected to hear Papa's cheerful voice. He usually came running out from the back to wrap her and Tony in a big hug. But it wasn't Papa who appeared, or Mr. Vita. It was Tony's mother, Mrs. Grasso. What was Mrs. Grasso doing here at the stable? Who was watching Tony's little sisters and his little brother Frankie? And then Carmen noticed the worried look on Mrs. Grasso's face. More than worried, Mrs. Grasso looked scared. A stab of fear slashed through Carmen's chest. Had something happened to Tony's father? Had Frankie broken his arm again? Did one of the little girls get bitten by a rat? But wait, why was Mrs. Grasso looking at Carmen? Why did she have tears in her eyes? "Carmen, mia cara, my dear." She took Carmen's hand. "I'm so sorry, but your papa is very sick." Chapter 5. Carmen wiped away tears as she and Tony and Mrs. Grasso hurried through the streets. Mrs. Grasso had explained what happened, that Papa had become very ill around lunchtime. Mr. Vita had took Papa home in a wagon. "He's in bed now," Mrs. Grasso continued as they passed the bakery. "The doctors already came. He said your father has some kind of flu." The word flu made Carmen feel calmer. The flu wasn't really a killer, like typhoid or polio or rabies. Carmen had the flu just last year. She felt rotten and was in bed for days. But within a week, she was back to herself. "Papa will be fine. Papa will be fine," Carmen repeated to herself as her boots clicked against the stone streets. And looking around her, everything was the same as always. There were little kids playing hide and seek between the pushcarts piled high with fruits and vegetables. There was Mrs. Ortelli through the window of the bakery, chattering with her customers. There was the gray cat sunning himself outside the tailor's shop, and the hams and sausages hanging in the butcher's window. There was a rat poking through a pile of trash, and of course there was Tony right next to her. But then, when they stopped at the corner to wait to cross the street, Carmen caught sight of something else. The newsboy, the one she and Tony had passed earlier, Carmen had barely listened to the headlines he'd been shouting out. But now Carmen slowed down and stared at the boy, waving the afternoon paper at people rushing by him. Suddenly, his words seemed meant just for Carmen. Deadly flu hits Boston. Carmen practically flew up the narrow staircase that led to the apartment. She rushed past Miss Rita into the small bedroom she and Papa shared. Another neighbor, Mrs. Pirelli, was kneeling next to Papa's bed, but the man in the bed, that couldn't be Papa. It looked like a shivering ghost, deathly pale, lips tinged blue, his teeth chattering, even though his bed was piled high with blankets. Papa, Carmen rasped, dropping down to her knees. Papa's eyes fluttered open. The ghostly mask fell away for a few seconds. Mia Ragazza, he rasped. My girl. Carmen sat down, blinking away tears, forcing a smile. She could cheer him up, just like she cheered up Tony. Papa, she said, her voice shaking. I got another 100 on my math test, but Papa's eyes were already closed again. Carmen grabbed his hand. It was so hot, as if it was boiling, as if his bones were on fire. She pulled a rickety chair over to the bed and sat down. I'm here, Papa, she said. I'm here. Hours passed and the sun went down. Papa tossed and turned, muttering in his sleep. And then came the cough, a hacking, wheezing cough like nothing Carmen had ever heard. It sounded like little bombs were exploding in Papa's lungs. Mrs. Pirelli and Mrs. Grasso sponged Papa's face and arms to cool him. They spooned medicine into his mouth, but Papa's skin got hotter. The cough got worse and worse. The cough got worse and worse. Carmen sat in her chair, gripping Papa's hand. Her mind kept drifting back to the flood after the earthquake, when Carmen clung to Papa's back as they were caught in the churning sea. Nana had told her the story so many times. I was up early that day, she always began, because the naughty goat escaped again. I just reached the top of the hill when everything started to shake. The earthquake lasted 40 seconds, but it felt like years, she said. When it was over, she raced down the hill to the house. The roof had collapsed, but Mama, Papa, and Carmen made it out and were safe. We thought the worst was over, but we were wrong. The earthquake had caused the sea to rise up. Now tidal waves 20 feet tall slammed into the village. Your Papa grabbed you and tried to run, Nana continued, but nobody could outrun the sea. Nana always got a twinkle in her eye at this point. The water was strong, but your Papa was stronger. He grabbed the shutter from a ruined house. He climbed up on it and told Carmen to hold on to his back. The water rose and rose. They got separated from Nana and Mama. They floated on the shutter for hours, and this was the part that had etched itself into Carmen's mind. Especially the words Papa had called out to her over and over. Hold on, he'd said. Now Carmen leaned into Papa an inch away from his sweat-covered brow. Hold on, Papa, she whispered. Please hold on. She gripped his hand. She held it tighter than she'd held onto Papa's back in the flood, tighter than anything she'd ever held in her life. She held on even after Papa stopped breathing, even after the doctor put the sheet over Papa's face, even after Papa's hand grew cold. And Carmen understood that some things can get taken away, no matter how hard you try to hold on to them. It wasn't until much later, when the sun came up, when Carmen finally let go. Chapter 6. Almost 4 months later, January 15th, 1919, 7:30 a.m. Carmen was awake, but she kept her eyes squeezed shut. The mornings were always the hardest. She finally eased her eyes open and took some deep breaths. She listened for Papa's voice in her mind, like she did every morning. Buongiorno, mia ragazza. Good morning, my girl. Good morning, Carmen whispered back. Hi, Carmy, a little voice chirped. Carmen looked down, and two sleepy brown eyes peeped up at her. It was little Teresa, Tony's 3-year-old sister. Go back to sleep, Carmen said with a smile. It's still early. Teresa flashed a gap-toothed grin and closed her eyes. At the end of the bed, Tony's other little sister, Mary, was curled up under a tattered blanket. Carmen reached over and tucked her tighter into bed. A snore rose up from the floor when that was Tony's 6-year-old brother Frankie. He was a skinny little bean, but he snored like a giant. He and Tony were asleep on a mattress tucked into the corner. Across the room, the curtain that hid Mr. and Mrs. Grasso's bed had already been pulled open. Carmen could hear them talking in the kitchen. This was Carmen's home now, the Grasso's two-apartment room. This was Carmen's home now, the Grasso's two-room apartment. She'd been living here since the night Papa had died. When Mr. Grasso carried her upstairs and tucked her into bed with the two little girls. There were 7 of them living here, crammed together like tomatoes in a jar. The noise was constant. The girls' giggles, Frankie's ball bouncing, Mr. Grasso's booming voice, and the fight. Frankie bit me. Mary wet the bed. Teresa is eating a cockroach. No wonder Tony couldn't study. But Carmen knew how lucky she was to be with the Grassos, who treated Carmen like family. Carmen looked over at Tony, fast asleep with drool dripping out of the corner of his mouth. He had hardly left Carmen since Papa had died. He'd even started reading The Wonderful Wizard of Oz aloud at bedtime. It put the girls to sleep, he said. But Carmen had a feeling he was reading it for her. He somehow sensed that hearing about Dorothy made Carmen feel better, like she wasn't the only girl who sometimes felt completely lost, worse than lost. There were moments every day when Carmen's heart seemed to be crumbling apart, like the church tower in a village after the earthquake. But then Tony would tell her one of his dumb jokes. Frankie would come racing over to show her a new baseball card. The girls would climb up onto her lap, or Mrs. Grasso would ask her to stir the pot of tomato gravy. Well, with all these kids, there was always work to be done. Carmen tried to help Mrs. Grasso as much as she could, which was what she should be doing now, instead of lying there like a lump. Carmen quickly got dressed. She stared out the window as she brushed the mass of her hair. Of course, her gaze went straight to the ugly molasses tank rising up in the distance. It was impossible to look out the window and not see it, and now the tank would always remind Carmen of that terrible day when Papa got sick. She remembered those strange noises she and Tony had heard, how they run away in fear and then fallen down laughing. It amazed Carmen to think of how carefree she felt on that bright September day. She'd had no idea that Papa was sick, that the Spanish influenza had already sunk its fangs into Boston. They would all soon find themselves caught in the middle of one of the deadliest disease outbreaks in history. The epidemic spread through Boston and across the country and the world. Tens of millions had died so far. Mr. Lawrence told them it was even more deadly than the Black Death, the plague that struck Europe during the time of the Knights. Here in Boston, hospitals ran out of beds. Schools and theaters and movie houses were shut down to slow the spread, but nothing helped. Bodies piled up in the streets. There weren't enough grave diggers to bury the hundreds dying each week. Carmen wasn't the only kid at school who lost a parent. Some lost two, and brothers and sisters too. So much had changed since she and Tony stood together in the shadows of the molasses tank. But that tank hadn't changed at all. It was just as huge and ugly in making. Carmen sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress and to button her brand new boots. The Grassos had given them to her for Christmas. Her last boots were so small her toenails would turn black. Carmen stood up and wiggled her grateful toes. She figured she'd help Mrs. Grasso with breakfast and then head to school with Tony and Frankie. She tiptoed toward the kitchen door. She could hear Mr. and Mrs. Grasso talking over their morning cups of espresso. Carmen's a gem, Mrs. Grasso was saying. The kids adore her. We were talking about her. Carmen got closer. She sure is, Mr. Grasso agreed. Carmen flushed and smiled a little. When are we going to tell her? Mr. Grasso said. The ship doesn't leave for another week, Mrs. Grasso said. No need to worry about the voyage. Carmen froze. Ship worry? It's such a long journey, Mr. Grasso said. It's going to be tough. Italy is very far from here. The hairs on the back of Carmen's neck stood up. I know, Mrs. Grasso said, but it's for the best. Carmen and her grandmother will be together again. Carmen stepped back. It was suddenly very hard to breathe. The room started to spin as she understood what they were saying. They were sending her back to Italy. Chapter 7. Carmen stood there frozen, barely breathing. Tony called over to her through a yawn. Hey, Carmen, are you pretending to be a statue or something? All the kids were awake now. 4 sets of big Grasso eyes were on her. The Wicked Witch of the West cast a spell on her, said Frankie. The kids all giggled, and Carmen knew they expected her to join in, but she couldn't laugh right now. She pushed the door open to the kitchen. She had to get out of the apartment before she burst into tears. She would go to the stable. Mr. Vito was in Connecticut visiting her cousin. Carmen could get Rosie and take her to the park. She wouldn't have to talk to anyone. She stumbled into the kitchen and headed straight for the Kodiak. Mrs. Grasso stood up. Carmen, do you feel all right? Yes, but I'm going back. I'm going to school, Carmen lied, struggling to keep her voice steady. She threw on her coat. Mr. Lawrence wants some help. So early, Mrs. Grasso said. It's barely 7, but Carmen was already in the hallway, ignoring the voices calling after her. She flew down the stairs and out the door onto the street. Her mind was whirling. How could they send her back? This couldn't be Nana's idea, could it? She and Carmen had been writing to each other nonstop, but Nana hadn't written a word about that. The Grassos knew how much Carmen missed Nana. Did they somehow think Carmen wanted to go back to Italy? Somehow, she made it to the stable. She waved hello to Mr. Paolo, the cheery old man who was watching the horses while Mr. Vito was gone. She hurried to Rosie's stall. She didn't bother with a saddle. She just climbed up on and clicked her tongue. Rosie knew what that meant. Go. They headed toward the park by the harbor. Usually the sounds of Rosie's horseshoes on the cobblestones was soothing to Carmen, but today each footstep was a hammer pounding on her heart. Clop, clop. She imagined herself saying goodbye to Mr. Vito. Clop, clop. To Mrs. Grasso. Clop, clop. To Tony. She stroked Rosie's mane. Who'd ride at her after Carmen left? Who would ride her after Carmen left? By this time, they reached the park. Carmen's chest felt bruised. She looked out at the ships, remembering how she and Papa first sailed into Boston Harbor. Papa was so excited. Anything is possible in America, Papa always said. If you work hard, a person can be anything they want to be. You couldn't be anything you wanted to be in southern Italy, though, not unless you were already very rich. Papa had barely earned money as a farmer. All the men who were farmers or fishermen. There were no other jobs. And girls, they got married and had babies. Carmen wanted a family of her own one day, but she didn't want that to be her only job. Maybe she would be a teacher like Mr. Lawrence or a nurse and help people who were sick. Or she could write a book like The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. She'd never do any of those things if she went back. There wasn't even a school in her village. Rosie came to a stop near the playground, as if she knew Carmen needed a break. Carmen slid down and buried herself in Rosie's mane, staring at her shiny new boots through the mare's soft white hair. Suddenly, anger boiled up inside of her. She wasn't angry at Grassos, not after everything they'd done for her. She was mad at herself. All the time she'd let herself feel a part of the Grassos family. But Mr. and Mrs. Grasso already had 4 kids. Mr. Grasso worked on construction sites where he probably earned no more than $30 a week. Carmen should have eaten less. She should have tried to find a job in a factory or as a maid for one of the rich families outside the North End. And she couldn't have accepted these boots for Christmas. Carmen kicked the dirt so hard that Rosie whinnied. "Sorry, girl," Carmen said, giving Rosie a gentle stroke on the forehead. Carmen paced back and forth, wrestling with the thoughts in her head. School would start soon, but Carmen decided for the first time ever to play hooky. What did math or spelling matter now that she was going back to Italy? The only math she'd need there would be for counting goats and rows of tomato plants. She'd never speak English again. Carmen stood there for what felt like hours, until she was so tired she had to sit down. She chose a spot under a tree and gazed out at the ships in the harbor. Again she thought of Papa. It had been Papa's dream to come to America, but now Papa was gone, and so was the life they'd built. Maybe the Grassos were right, Carmen realized. Maybe it was time to go back to Italy, to her old life, to where she could be with Nana. Carmen leaned against the tree. She imagined her grandmother's arms around her. Then she closed her eyes and fell into a restless sleep. Chapter 8. 3 hours later, around noon, waterfront, the North End, Boston. Carmen's eyes snapped open and she scrambled to her feet. She thought she'd dozed off for a minute or two, but now the day was very bright and warm. She unbuttoned her coat and looked around. Some men were on benches with open lunch pails. It must be past noon. Carmen couldn't believe she'd slept so long. Everyone must be worried about her. She had to get back to the Grassos' apartment. Or maybe she should go to school. Maybe she should. And then her insides turned to jelly. Where was Rosie? Carmen whirled around, but the horse was nowhere to be seen. What a fool Carmen was. She hadn't tied Rosie up, and now what if the horse had wandered into the busy street? She could get hit by a motor car. That happened all the time. Before Carmen knew it, she was running, screaming Rosie's name. Carmen sprinted to the stable. She burst through the door and over to Rosie's stall, but Rosie wasn't there. Think, Carmen, think, she said to herself as she ran back outside. Rosie was smart. Where would she go? Carmen stopped and looked around. It was always so crowded down here by the water, even more packed than the streets up where Carmen lived. Men were everywhere. Trucks and wagons rumbled by. Carmen was sprinting by a nearby shed when she noticed her eyes were watering. Her nose was burning too. Blah! What was that sticky, sweet smell? Molasses, she realized. The thick smell was in the air, worse than ever before. It even coated her throat. The molasses tank was just behind her. She turned it around, and what she saw made her heart skip a beat. Rosie, the mare, was standing at the tank, licking molasses off the sides. Carmen almost cried with relief as she came up next to Rosie. Smart horse. Carmen remembered how Rosie licked the molasses from Tony's fingers. She must have smelled the molasses in the air and followed it right to the tank. So you wanted a little snack, Carmen said, patting Rosie's forehead. The mare smacked her lips. Her whiskers were dripping with glue. And I guess you're saving some for later, Carmen said. She grabbed a handkerchief from her pocket and started wiping Rosie's face. That's when she heard it. Grr, gah, 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 grr, gah, 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 gah. Carmen ignored the strange growling sound. It was just the molasses boiling inside the tank. She knew that now. And then Carmen heard a familiar voice. Carmen! It was Tony. He was running toward her from back near the stable. Carmen swung herself out onto Rosie and clicked her tongue. They trotted over to meet Tony. His face was bright red and his hair was damp with sweat. Where have you been? He said, his voice cracking. We've been searching everywhere for you. So he looked so worried, and she could tell he'd been crying. Carmen reached down and grabbed his hand. I'm so sorry, she said. But she didn't know what to say. She felt terrible for disappearing like that, like she had. And now she wondered, did Tony know what about the Did Tony know about the plan to send her back to Italy? Did he realize that in a week Carmen would be gone and they'd never see each other again? Just the idea of saying goodbye to Tony, to everyone, made her whole body shake. But wait, it wasn't Carmen's body that was shaking, or Rosie's, it was the ground. This time she felt sure that it was an earthquake. Carmen gripped Rosie's neck tighter, expecting the ground to split apart. The horse snorted and nervously stamped her feet. "What's going on?" Tony said. A man near them screamed out the answer in a voice filled with panic. "It's the tank!" Chapter 9. Grr, gug, 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 grr, gug, 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 gug. The noise got louder and louder, drowning out the horns, the honks and rattles echoing from busy commercial street. But it wasn't the growling gurgles that sent stabs of fear through Carmen. The entire tank was rocking back and forth. The rounded sides were bulging in and out. The metal groaned and squeaked, and then bang, 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 bang! Something small hit the ground, inches away from Tony's boot. Carmen stared. It was a tiny piece of metal, the size of Carmen's finger, covered with brown syrup. "It's one of the bolts," Carmen cried. "The bolts, rabbits, that held the tank together. There were thousands of them, and now all the rabbits seemed to let go of the tank at once. Bang, 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 bang! They blasted through the air like bullets. Bang, 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 bang! Rosie whinnied. They had to get away from there. "Tony," Carmen said quickly. She offered him her hand to help him climb up onto Rosie with her. "Get on, let's go." But just then, a rabbit came whistling through the air. It hit Rosie in the neck. She let out a high-pitched screeching cry. Then she reared up as blood spurted from the wound. Carmen fell off and hit the ground hard, and before she knew it, Rosie had taken off without Carmen. "Rosie!" Carmen screamed. Tony was at her side in a flash, pulling her up. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" But Carmen didn't have time to answer. Kaboom! The tank shattered apart. Jagged sheets of metal went whirling through the air. As the tank collapsed, the molasses inside seemed to hover in the air for a split second, a massive rolling cloud, and then it crashed to the ground, a colossal churning wave. The gagging stench of the molasses rushed up Carmen's nose and down her throat, deep into her guts. Screams of terror pounded in her ears. Shouts in English and Italian. "Help me! Run! Get out of here!" Carmen couldn't help looking back as she and Tony ran for their lives. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The wave of molasses was at least 20 feet tall and swirling and churning in every direction. With each passing second, it devoured more of the waterfront. It smashed into buildings, tearing them to pieces. It picked up sheds and wagons and horses and men. The roar got louder as the wave filled the wreckage. She and Tony ran as fast as they could, but the wave was faster. Within seconds, it had caught them. Chapter 10. Was this how Papa felt when the tidal wave swept up over the village? When the churning water grabbed him and Carmen and pulled them out to sea? No, Carmen thought, because this wave was nothing like water. It was thick and gooey. It felt alive as it rose up around her legs. Carmen had read about a kind of snake that wrapped itself around its prey, choking it to death. Now Carmen felt like 1,000 snakes were wrapping themselves around her, trying to pull her down. She and Tony locked eyes. What should they do? What could they do? It became impossible to run. With each step was a battle through the thick slime, and with every blink the molasses was rising higher, to their waists, to their chests. Carmen's clothes were soaked. The goo coated her skin. It was already hardening around her, trapping her inside the shell. The molasses was up to her chin now. Globs splashed into her mouth. Sickly, sweet, sharp, and bitter. It made her think of rot, of old garbage left out in the sun, buzzing with flies, crawling with rats. Her stomach twisted. She was afraid she would be sick. She and Tony looked desperately around, but everyone near them was struggling too. There was nobody here to help them. Carmen thought of Papa again, how he'd found this old shutter to float on. That's what they needed, a piece of wreckage to keep them from sinking. And just then Carmen saw it, something big made of wood. It was part of a horse wagon. "Tony, grab that!" she screamed. There was not a second to waste. It took all of Carmen's strength to propel herself forward through this muck. She pulled herself on the wagon so half of her body was out of the molasses. Tony grabbed hold of the side, but before he could pull himself up, he lost his grip on the slime-covered wagon of the slime-covered wood. Carmen clung to the wagon with one hand, and she reached down with the other. She managed to grab Tony's arm, and with every last bit of strength she had, she yanked him hard. He threw his arms over a wagon wheel, locking them together. The wagon bobbed and wove in the churning molasses. Terrible sounds rose up around them, cries of fear and moans of pain, the screeching of metal. Molasses coated Carmen's face in itching, burning, dripping mass. She and Tony huddled together, too terrified to talk, and all they could do was look around in horror. Now Carmen knew how Dorothy felt when she fell out of the tornado and landed in the strange land of Oz. Except that Oz was a magical land with bright colors and jeweled cities. This strange place was a nightmare, a wasteland of rubble covered with brown slime. The destruction reminded Carmen of the pictures she'd seen in the newspaper of the battlefields in the Great War. The cities and forests of France and Belgium turned to shattered ruins. Wagons, motor cars, and parts of buildings swirled around them, and people. A man, his shoulder badly bloodied, clung to a barrel. Another man was splashing wildly, trying to keep his head above the surface. A woman was face down, not moving at all. How many people were trapped in this flood? Dozens? Hundreds? Was Tony's family safe? What about Mr. Lawrence and the kids at school? And what about Rosie? Carmen leaned harder against Tony, and that's when he screamed. "Watch out!" From nowhere, a giant piece of the tank smacked into the wagon, nearly flipping it over. Tony managed to keep his grip, but Carmen slipped off. "Carmen!" Tony's voice was the last thing she heard as the molasses swallowed her up. Chapter 11. Carmen desperately kicked her legs and spun around. She stretched out her neck to try to get her head above the goo, but the molasses was like quicksand. The more she flailed, the deeper she sank. Beneath the surface, claws of metal ranked into her legs, splitting open her flesh. She felt the blood spill out of her, gushing into the swirling river that was carrying her away. It was no use struggling, she realized. The molasses was too strong, too powerful. How did she think she could fight back? The force of the flood pushed her forward. She somersaulted in the muck. She gagged and coughed and struggled to breathe through her molasses-clogged nose and mouth. No, she couldn't fight this. It was impossible. Soon there was only darkness and pain, and then a voice in her mind, just a whisper at first. "Hold on." It got louder. "Hold on, Papa." Was he here with her? No, it was just his voice calling to her. He was telling her what she needed to do, but this time Carmen was all alone in the raging flood. It would be up to her to keep herself afloat, and she would not give up, not without a fight. She somehow managed to straighten her body. She let herself sink down until her feet touched the solid ground. Then she pushed off, propelling herself up through the goo. Her head broke through the surface. She managed to take a breath before she sank down again. "Hold on." Down, up. She went over and over again. The fourth time she came up, she managed to open her burning eyes for just a few seconds, long enough to see an empty wooden crate floating by her, long enough to reach out for it, to get her arms around it. She held on, like she had before, like Papa had taught her. Blood spilled from her leg. Her heart slowed. The world became blurred. Sounds faded, but she didn't let go, not until the men found her washed up next to a smashed house and pried her arms away. They wiped the molasses from her nose and lifted her up. Sirens wailed, voices called to her, but Carmen felt very far away from the north end. In Carmen's mind, she was with Papa, and she didn't want to leave him. Chapter 12. 3 days later, January 18th, 1919, around 7 a.m., Boston City Hospital. "Hello, are you awake?" Carmen's eyes opened. A woman was holding her hand. Was it Mrs. Grasso? No, this woman was very young, with red hair and freckles. She was wearing a white cape. A nurse, Carmen realized. "Hello, darling," the nurse said, her Irish accent tickling Carmen's ears. "I knew you were waking up." Carmen looked around. A pink curtain surrounded her bed. She was in hospital. She tried to sit up, but her legs flapped in pain. Carmen sucked in her breath. Don't fuss too much, love, the young nurse said. You have quite a wound on your leg. Lost yourself quite a lot of blood. Doctors stitch you up, though. You'll be running around soon enough. How long have they been here? Carmen asked. Her voice was scratchy. The nurse left Carmen's pillow and straightened her blanket. 3 days. 3 days? How is that possible? Carmen lay back as the nurse took her pulse. You're in good shape, the nurse said, compared to some of the others who would have ever thought a molasses tank could explode like that. The whole waterfront is gone, you know. They're going to be cleaning up for months. Carmen's mind was clearing. It was all slowly coming back to her. The shattered tank, the raging rivers of molasses, the bodies floating by. Carmen sat up and gasped. Tony, she blurted out. What had happened to Tony? Who? The nurse said. My friend, my best friend. Just then, someone called from the other side of the room. Nurse, we need you here. Don't you worry, love, the nurse said to Carmen. You rest now. I'll be back. And she disappeared through the curtain, leaving Carmen all alone. But she wasn't alone for long. Carmen heard them before she saw them. I want to see her first. No, me. You pushed me. Did not. A stampede of little footsteps clattered across the tile floor. The curtain flew open, and the three littlest Grasso kids swarmed around her bed. They all stared at her 6 enormous brown eyes. Frankie broke out into a huge grin. He raised his hand up into the air. She's alive! He bellowed. Carmen laughed. Mrs. Grasso came rushing after them, out of breath. She took one look at Carmen and started crying, but her face lit up with a smile even as the tears poured down. Carmen held her breath, afraid to hope, and then seconds later another face appeared. Battered, scraped, smiling Tony. Chapter 13. Carmen was getting stronger, but the doctors worried the wound on her leg. They told her she needed to stay in the hospital at least another week. Carmen was tired of laying in bed, but at least she wasn't lonely. Mrs. Grasso came every day with a feast of pasta or lasagna. Mrs. Ortelli brought boxes of cream-filled cannoli and crunched biscotto. She shared with the nurses. Frankie brought his baseball cards. Teresa and Mary sat on Carmen's bed, braiding her hair over and over. Mr. Lawrence brought books. Carmen missed Mr. Vita. He still wasn't back from Connecticut, but Mr. Paolo stopped by one day. You have a visitor, Mr. Paolo said, but she had to wait outside. He helped Carmen out of the bed and to the window, and there, tied up in front of the hospital, was Rosie. We found her near the stable, Mr. Palace said, or what was left of it. The table had been destroyed, along with the fire department and almost every other building around the part of the waterfront. Carmen couldn't imagine how upset Mr. Vita would be, but at least his other horses were all safe. They'd been far from the north end when the flood happened, and now Carmen could see for herself that Rosie was all in one piece. The cut on her neck was healing up fine. The cut on her neck is healing up fine, Mr. Palace said. Carmen opened the window. It's good to see you, girl. Carmen called out to Rosie, waving. The horse's ears perked up. She let out a loud, happy whinny. Tears sprang into Carmen's eyes, and not only from the relief of seeing Rosie unhurt. Carmen realized she'd probably never ride Rosie again, because not only would she be leaving the hospital soon, she'd also be leaving America. Nobody had mentioned that Carmen was going back to Italy, but someone would soon. Carmen was sure. Mrs. Grasso had probably already packed Carmen's clothes. Carmen shut the window, forcing those thoughts out of her mind. She had to focus on getting better right now. Of all the people who came to visit, it was Tony she looked forward to seeing the most. Tony told Carmen what had happened after they were separated. His ride on the broken wagon had been short. He'd been swept out to the commercial street, where the river of Molasses became shallower and shallower. He'd splashed his way out and wandered around in a daze. It was terrible, he told Carmen, his face darkening. His voice dropped down to a whisper. The bodies, bent and broken, so covered with molasses that he couldn't tell if they were men or women. People crying in pain, injured horses, and mothers screaming for their children, police everywhere. Mrs. Grasso was already looking for him, searching frantically. She'd found him pretty quickly. And then we'll look for you, Tony said. Tony told Carmen, now his lip quivering. Mr. Grasso had gone to the Haymark Relief Station, a small hospital near the north end. That's where the dead were laid out. Men who'd been working around the waterfront, a man who lived in a house along Commercial Street, 2 10-year-old children who'd been near the tank. But not Carmen. More than 150 people had been hurt, carried away by the river of molasses, trapped in crushing buildings, struck by flying metal when the tank exploded. One man was blasted all the way into the Boston harbor. Injured people were in the hospital all across the city. It was 3 days after Mr. Grasso finally found Carmen in Boston City Hospital in the South End. Tony told Carmen something else that shocked her. What the molasses company was saying about why the tank broke apart. They say someone put a bomb in the tank. Carmen sat up in bed. Those liars, she exclaimed, her voice so furiously loud others had peeked in to her. But she couldn't believe it. Everyone in the north end knew why the tank shattered, because it wasn't built right. Even little kids knew that. The tank had leaked from the moment it was built. Don't worry, Tony had said to her. Nobody believes them. Carmen could only hope Tony was right. On her last night in the hospital, Carmen barely slept. Every time she drifted off, she'd fall into a nightmare. She kept reliving the moment when the wagon almost flipped, when she was drowning in the sticky darkness, when she heard Papa's voice calling to her, and now Papa's voice echoed through her mind again. Hold on, hold on, hold on. Why was she still hearing these words? Carmen was safe now. Nothing was going to sweep her away, but Papa's voice got louder. Hold on, hold on. What was Papa trying to tell her? What should she be holding on to now? Sometimes in the wee hours of the morning, Carmen got out of bed and limped over to the window. The moon was bright and the flickering street lamps cast a glow in the city. She could almost see over the north end. Somewhere out there, the Grassos were curled up. 2 girls under tattered blankets, 2 boys on the floor, 2 parents in the bed across the room. Her school was out there too, waiting for students to arrive the next morning. Mr. Lawrence had his lessons all planned out. A warm feeling spread through her body because she suddenly knew that Papa was telling her to hold on to their life here in America. The life they had built together, the friends they had made, the school she loved so much. She took a deep breath, lifting her chin. I hear you, Papa, she said. Right then, she knew she could not go back to Italy. And if the Grassos needed help paying for their food and clothes, she'd figure out how to get a job. There would be people here to help her. The Grassos and Mr. Lawrence and the neighbors. Rosie too. It would be very hard. Carmen knew it to work and also go to school. Anything was possible. Didn't mean everything would be easy. But Carmen would hold on no matter what. Chapter 14. The next evening, around 6 p.m., the Grassos' apartment, the north end. Carmen sat in a chair watching Mrs. Grasso cook up a storm. The kids were bouncing off the walls. The apartment was filled with delicious smells, garlic and tomatoes and milky melted cheese. Everyone was excited for the special dinner Mrs. Grasso was making in the honor of Carmen leaving the hospital. Best of all, Mr. Vita was joining them too. He was finally back from Connecticut. Mr. Grasso had gone to meet him at the train station. When is Mr. Vita coming with Carmen's present? Frankie asked. This was the 3rd time today someone had mentioned a present for Carmen. Shh, Tony said, slugging Frankie's arm. The present is a surprise. You, shh, Frankie said, giving Tony a shove. I want a present, Teresa whined. My present, wailed Mary. Mrs. Grasso looked up from her pot. Basta, enough. Tony, please take everyone into the bedroom. Make sure the bed is made. But, Mama... Go, Mrs. Grasso said. Tony looked at Carmen, who could only shrug helplessly. She wanted to help him with the kids, but the doctors had warned that Carmen had to rest her leg. Mrs. Grasso had ordered her to stay put in that chair. Tony herded the kids into the bedroom. The door closed, and Mrs. Grasso looked up at Carmen with a relieved smile. Some peace. Carmen smiled back. Tell her now, Carmen thought. They were finally alone. Now was her chance to tell Mrs. Grasso that she wasn't going back to Italy. Carmen cleared her throat. She was afraid Mrs. Grasso would be mad, that she wouldn't understand, but Carmen still had to tell her. Mrs. Grasso, she said, I need to talk to you. Yes, dear, Mrs. Grasso said. Carmen took a deep breath and blurted it out. I know about the plan for me to go back to Italy. Mrs. Grasso's eyes widened in surprise. Carmen swallowed hard, but didn't lose her nerve. I'm sorry, but Carmen went on. I overheard you and Mr. Grasso talking about the ship. I know you want me to go back to Italy, to be with Nana. Carmen, I'm sorry, but I've decided, Carmen said. She sat up tall in a chair. I want to stay here. There. Carmen had done it. Mrs. Grasso rushed over. She bent down so her eyes were shook, so she was eye to eye with Carmen. Carmen, she said, we never said you were going back to Italy. You weren't getting on any ship. But I heard you say Carmen's words were cut off by the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs and Mr. Grasso's booming voice. We're back! The bedroom door burst open and the kids spilled out. Carmen and Mrs. Grasso would have to finish their talks some other time. Tony rushed over to Carmen. He beamed at her. He looked like he was about to burst with excitement. I hear them, Frankie cried. The little girls were jumping up and down. What was going on? Carmen knew the kids liked Mr. Vita, but you'd think Babe Ruth and the Red Sox were coming for dinner. The apartment door swung open. Mr. Grasso stood in front. Mr. Grasso strode in, followed by Mr. Vita. The room went strangely quiet, but the air seemed to be crackling. Carmen noticed that everyone was looking at Mr. Vita. Carmen noticed that nobody was looking at Mr. Vita. They were all looking at her, and then someone else appeared in the doorway. A smiling gray-haired woman with eyes blazed like candles. Carmen blinked, sure she was dreaming. But then, before she realized it, she'd leaped out of the chair. She was rushing forward, hurt leg and all. Two strong arms came around her in a crushing hug. It was Nana. I miss you too much, Nana said a few minutes later, when she and Carmen were alone in the bedroom. When they finally stopped hugging and crying, I wrote to Mrs. Grasso. Mr. Vita was kind enough. I wrote to Mr. Grasso. Mr. Vita was kind enough to come to Italy to help me make the journey. So there had been a secret plan, just not the one Carmen imagined. Did you come here to bring me home? She asked Nana, suddenly worried. Nana leaned forward, brushing the hair from Carmen's eyes. She shook her head. I think this is your home, Tesoro, she said. Your papa brought you here, and I know how sad the Grassos would be if you left, especially that Tony. Carmen looked at Nana. Had it really been 4 years since they'd been together? How had Carmen lived without Nana? Will you stay here with me? Carmen asked. Anything is possible, right? Nana smiled. For a while. We'll see how I like it. Carmen hugged Nana again. She breathed in Nana's familiar smell of lemons and flowers and the sea of the village where Carmen was born. She felt a pang in her heart as she realized how much she missed Italy. Of course, she wanted to go back there, just not now, and not forever. Could she and Nana have two homes with an ocean in between? She opened her mouth to ask, but there was pounding on the door and restless, excited voices calling to them. Come on, we're hungry. I get to sit next to Nana at dinner. No, I do. Nana stood up. We better get out there, she said with a wink. They all walked through the door, holding hands, holding on tight. there would be plenty of time for Nana and Carmen to talk about what had happened, about what was ahead. Right now, the table was set. Dinner was hot, and their family was waiting for them. The end. Bye, and thanks for reading I Survived the Great Molasses Flood, 1919, by Lauren Tarshis. So, until next time, bye.